Dragmatic.
The ideal that man could aspire to is denigrated. With your ideal in tatters, you're weak. That's definition.
The question is, are you hungry enough and willing to fucking eat shit, or are you soft?
Everybody gonna be laughing at you. So the thing is this, you gotta understand uncomfortable realities about women. And one of the most uncomfortable realities is women tend to live opportunistically. It is what it is, guys. It's hardwired into them.
What does that mean? That means that they will die alone. What it means is you will, in effect, leave this planet with nothing to show for it.
Nihilism is what scares me in young dudes the most nowadays, because I think the moment that people do start, particularly young white dudes, do start embracing that nothingness, that to me is where all the really dark shit can grow. It's that absence of belief that I think makes such a fertile ground for all the shit that we've been talking about.
So almost a year ago, I released a video called Edgelord Movies and the Men Who Love Them. It was actually loosely based on research I had been doing for years on the Manosphere, specifically around spree shooters for my graduate studies. I had only been making videos for around a year and had little to no traction or momentum for the channel, maybe like 500 subscribers at the time. And I was just trying new things. I had only recently started speaking on camera in my videos. In fact, I think this is maybe the second video that I had done on cam. So today I'm making a video that, I don't know, I wonder if this will be received in the way I hope it will. And I was kind of scared, and it's very much an experiment. And in a lot of ways, I didn't know what I was doing. I knew that I knew my topic area, but you can watch the video and see the phone that I was filming on. This Samsung Galaxy Note. I took a car mount that I was using for this phone and stuck that thing on a plate and then put a book on top of the plate to keep it stable. And that's how I filmed that video, and filmed almost all of my videos for months, even as the channel grew. Break Bread was filmed on that phone. Yeah, I think after Break Bread was when I finally got a camera that I could use, or maybe even that's not true. Anyway, the point is, I have recorded over 2 hours worth of footage that I whittled down to about a 40-minute video, and in the process, I cut out large chunks of ideas that I wanted to explore on that topic. But despite all of that, it was a well-received video. It's still one of my most popular videos that regularly gets views to this day, and it even got the attention of a anti-SJW content creator who reacted to my video in a 3.5 hour live stream. There are a lot of people, a lot of mostly young white men that are just out there bad. That's the
And they're the only ones who are gonna hate this video. The only ones. There's so many white men. They're out there bad right now, man. They out here having opinions different from me and shit.
I do know that Jalong Bonnie at the time had about 90,000 subscribers, and I had probably less than 1,000. That wasn't very nice of her. But now she has 98,000 subscribers, and man, how petty would it be if I was to ask y'all to go and subscribe to her channel and push her up to 100,000 subscribers so she can get her plaque, because she's been working really hard. She puts out a lot of content. She has excellent thumbnails, no shade. Thumbnail game is on point. And so she can get her silver plaque and always know that it was me that helped her get it. How petty would that be? I wouldn't do nothing like that. I wouldn't do nothing like that. But no, seriously, instead of supporting me by being petty, I'm actually way more interested in you supporting today's sponsor. Legitimately excited at the sponsor I have today, because it's unlike some of the sponsorships that you usually see on YouTube. So please, please check it out. You all know I've been making videos for, well, a couple of years now, actually, but specifically making videos that are significant and seen by a decent enough audience for 6-7 months. And within that time, I've had more than a few sponsorships. And I can feel pretty good about the fact that I've never tried to present you all with anything that I wouldn't use myself, or anything that I had, at least at the time, ethical or moral concerns about presenting to you as an audience. But only every once in a while do I get a sponsor where when they come through, I'm like, no, I definitely want to work with them. I definitely want to be a part of what they're trying to do. And that is what's happening today with Kugali Media. Kugali Media is an independent African storytelling and comic book company that has been putting out comics, all with they focus on telling African stories from a variety of standpoints, with a variety of styles and subject matter and artists, and just things that we talk about wanting to have in Black nerd communities and subcultures, but we don't have enough of. There's something about Kugali and the variety of stories and energy and just styles in their work that makes me feel that they might be that first independent comic creator to fully penetrate into the mainstream on their own terms. And the way they do that is with our help, and that's what I'm here to do today. As of the release of this video, Kugali is launching a Kickstarter for their newest comic, Moringa. Moringa is an Afrofuturist sci-fi political saga that follows a colorful group of characters as they address issues connected to colonialism and the advance of AI and technology and chosen family. It's also one of Kugali's first explicitly queer-oriented titles, so it's putting images of Black and or African queer people at the forefront of their content, making sure that within the oeuvre of all the stuff that they're doing, that everybody feels welcome and represented. And I'm extremely excited that I can come to you to say that if you click on the link in the description, you can find their Kickstarter and you can support the production and the creation of this comic and Kugali Comics in general. So I want to say thank you to Kugali Comics for giving me the opportunity to be a part of what you all are trying to do. I hope you all support their Kickstarter, and of course, enjoy the rest of the video. So I've grown a lot over the past year as a creator and learned more about just being more professional at this job, and even got an editor. And I've also kind of like had to engage with the unique responsibility of existing as a male creator on BreadTube or LeftTube, especially as a Black male creator on BreadTube or LeftTube with a relatively significant following. I've attained a space where people value my content, and I want to honor that sense of respect to people liking what I have to say and wanting to know about my opinions on certain things. As really a lot of things have begun to fully settle in my head, I've often wanted to return to this topic of edgelords, but with more perspective, more research, more empathy, more voices, more everything really. Another thing that hit me is how it would be unique on some level to talk about the subject of this topic in the same way that I talked about Nicki Minaj in my last video, where I made sure to bring on Black films who had been there in the moment to experience Nicki's rise. Or when I talked about Black love a little while ago and made sure to bring in people with a variety of experiences of loving or being loved while Black. I've long noticed, however, that when it comes to talking about whiteness and white men, although of course it's usually white men doing all of the talking, they never fully occupy the space solely as a subject, the same way that non-white or non-men do when other topics arise. We tend to situate being white and male as a default status with minimal need to assess or examine it critically as a specific intersection of identity. We don't look at being white and being male as its own thing and not as a control group for other things to be compared to. When we think of intersectionality, we never think that white maleness is an intersection when it is. But even just me evoking the concept of intersectionality and saying the intersection of whiteness and maleness, and for the most part cisgendered and hetero, that's somewhat transgressive. And I know from experience that there are going to be those who are uncomfortable with evoking such a standpoint or critical lens to talk about white men. And I get that. So this video was not supposed to start like this. It was not supposed to start at the editing table. However, 99% of this video was written and recorded over 2 weeks ago. And in that time, there have been 3 spree shootings to hit the media that we know of, and possibly even more. This video was meant to be an examination of the manosphere and serve as My perspective on it as a whole, from its history to its reason for existing, to its less toxic elements, all the way over to the extreme portions of it that in some ways lead to what we have been seeing these past few weeks. The first major chunk of this video, made before the recent news, takes a empathetic and inquisitive look at the types of boys and men and behavior that we often associate with spree shooters. I make a relatively transgressive argument that says that we need to look explicitly at the intersection between whiteness and maleness, and it's awkward. It feels weird to do that, and it feels even weirder and almost kind of gross under the circumstances. However, this is based on research I did for my PhD program, which I am not finishing. Don't ask, but life is too short. And my research tells me that this is a sound and reasonable angle to engage with, to make sense of these types of events and the manosphere as a whole. And later in the video, I do take a more critical look at spree shootings, and specifically this type of gendered spectacle violence, and how really in a lot of ways we don't have the best understanding of how race plays into it. However, under the circumstances, my fear is that the tone of this first chunk, combined with the energy around this topic right now, might turn people off initially, especially since I know most people won't watch more than the first 30 minutes of this video. If I'm lucky, this video's long as hell. I'm sorry, I had a lot to say. I think my explanation and examination of this particular part of the issue is useful and even more timely considering the situation, but paradoxically, it's also poorly timed because all of us are still going through this right now in the moment. And it's not always easy to jump into a philosophical discussion about an ongoing current crisis. So in the end, what I'm really asking for here is that you give me grace. And if you can, watch the whole video, watch it in chunks. There's chapters in the description. This was a tough video to make even before the recent events. But all that said, I'm definitely not the final voice on this topic. And I'm sure that there are some things that I will get wrong or miss completely. But my heart is in the right place, I promise. Okay, now that the dramatic tension that I envisioned when making this video has been thoroughly destroyed, let's just go ahead and start it anyway. But I personally think that this is part of the problem, really. By leaving white men as this box that is perpetually By leaving white men as this box that is perpetually checked when we begin to analyze social issues, we leave a lot of details and information underdeveloped. Now, I don't know if what I'm about to do will work because I am doing something a bit transgressive, but that's the nature of science. So if it doesn't work, I'm sure somebody will come behind me and fix it. And if it does work, maybe we'll do something special here. And to make it work as best as I can, I have made the effort to talk to some white dudes, all of which have that unique standpoint of the edgelord identity that can provide some perspective explicitly about how whiteness and maleness contributes to it. And if this video's length is an indicator, shit may get complex, so we shall see.
Oh, they don't really mean what they're saying. This is all a joke. Everybody in 4chan's a Nazi. Like, they all pretend to be a Nazi. They all pretend to be whatever. They all pretend to be pedophiles.
At a point.
Exactly. And looking back, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but I really didn't pick up on how dangerous that was. And I just thought it was just another way of being funny and making jokes. And this was I think this is an extremely intentional thing. This is the sort of thing that white nationalists will talk about as a way of radicalizing people.
A lot of anxiety about I'm saying edgy stuff, but everybody here is cool with it, right? And as I got older, I would realize more and more just because your white friends are cool with it doesn't necessarily mean it's cool. So yeah, I understand some of where these people begin, because I think a lot of them begin in a similar place. And I sort of saw the direction that things would go. I would be on forums and I would watch those forums slowly become more conservative until all the people like me kind of stopped wanting to post there. And then, the alt-right happened and Trump got elected and Charlottesville happened. And all of these things made me realize okay, I need to get more explicitly political in my videos.
My family, I felt like I was just fading into the background. And at school, like I went to an all boys school where like a sensitive young lad such as me sort of faded into the background. And there it was just like a very hyper masculine environment. And as a result of that, I feel like I needed to claim my own power outside of traditional masculinity. And around that time, I was like quite into anime and such. And I wasn't listening to metal music, but I listened to music that had like a good amount of edge to it. Funny thing, like in retrospect, like I didn't realize like this is depression that I was feeling. Yeah, as a result, I just sort of retreated into the things that pandered to my need to feel angry at something.
100%. Like, I think the only reason I probably don't have, you know, a bunch of problematic shit floating out about me is because I didn't have, you know, a Twitter account when I was 15. You know, like I was that kid. Like I was never as like passionate about it or identified with it as hard. But yeah, I mean, like if I could go back and like all the like shitty things I said and stupid jokes I made, there were so many of them, you know, and that is definitely not something I think back to with any degree of pride. But like I think part of the problem with a lot of this stuff is not admitting that that's a part of you growing up when it absolutely is.
So I've talked about edgelords before, but I don't know if I've ever defined them. Initially, I thought I would struggle to craft a definition that felt effective, but I was surprised to learn that Oxford and Webster dictionaries have pretty useful definitions and even an entire short article on the concept of being an edgelord. Oxford states,
a person who affects a provocative or extreme persona, especially online, typically used of a man. Like FD signifier.
Webster states in a short article,
for all the internet offers, it sure does come with a lot of drama. Bickering in comment sections, thirsty attention seekers on Instagram. If you spend any significant time online, you're likely to encounter some odd and difficult personalities. One such person might be an edgelord. The word has taken hold to refer to one who makes wildly dark and exaggerated statements, usually on an internet forum, with the intent of shocking others. There is usually a tone of nihilism to such remarks, the kind that might be flagged by a counselor as antisocial behavior, similar to FD signifier.
Urban Dictionary, I think, has one of the most useful definitions, and I know Urban Dictionary is not a appropriate source, but I think for like internet slang, it's probably one of the most appropriate sources. I don't know.
A poster on an internet forum, particularly 4chan, who expresses opinions which are either strongly nihilistic or contain references to Hitler, Nazism, fascism, or other taboo topics which are deliberately intended to shock or offend readers. Kinda like FD signifier.
These definitions, I think there's three things that are important to establish. One, edgelords are a specific type of internet troll identity. Two, edgelords are invested in the shock value of their personas and behavior and the attention that comes from it. And three, edgelords actively reject conventional social behavior and to an extent, interests and identities that may be more appropriate for the status quo. Four, edgelord ideology has a lot of connective tissue with problematic schools of thought such as nihilism and fascism. A lot of the academic discourse around edgelords focuses explicitly on right-wing, neo-Nazi, and fascist activity online. However, a lot of this academic inquiry looks at the pre- and post-Gamergate / rise of Donald Trump era of online communities. However, in the last few years, a lot of edgelords have been, at least on some level, converted from white-wing ideologies into more leftist or progressive political positions through the efforts of a variety of left-leaning content creators and political streamers, aka debate streamers and debate bros. And don't worry, we won't be here. We won't be here for long. We won't be here for long.
There are different roles like mockery can play in getting people out, but I do think there's this niche of, okay, but how do you actually connect with people, and how do you actually figure out what is this individual person's story? Why is this serving a need for them right now? And how can we get that need met in a better, healthier way? And one of the reasons I think we don't see it a lot on YouTube is that like maybe YouTube is not the best way to do it. But if you're doing that publicly, right? Like if we had a debate channel where we were like, let me help deprogram you, it may be very helpful for that person. But you've also got how many people watching who are hearing you let all kinds of horrible things just ride unchallenged.
While the success of these conversions and reclamation of these edgy boys is in debate, the personal identity of being edgy or an edgelord is still pretty universal regardless of the political ideology at the core of the edginess. This is because the interests of edgelords, such as video games, anime, tech, etc., and where they tend to collect online has not changed regardless of the political affiliation. And to be clear, those interests are not of any real material issue outside of some concerning patterns you might find in the porn consumption of edgelords and the depictions of minors in some anime. For now, I want to disregard the political affiliation, although I think it's fair to say that the majority of edgelords are either overtly right-leaning, in some cases far-right, or at least amenable to far-right ideology or in recovery from far-right ideology, and in the process of unlearning and maybe detoxing from it. Let's put a pin in discussing the more explicit political elements of this, though, and just focus on the ideology as a whole. I truly feel like the actual politics of being an edgelord are secondary to the identity of being an edgelord. Because far-right politics have an advantage here, because more leftists and more left-leaning political frames are far less tolerant of edgelord behavior than the far right. In my last edgelord video, and I think in pop culture, we often see the Joker as the quintessential edgelord icon. And we see that in the way he is celebrated as an icon in popular media, especially for the young, mostly white males that fit the previous description of edgelords.
Is it hot in here? I'm gonna take off my coat. As I was saying.
And not just explicitly the Joker, but also numerous versions of what I think is essentially the same chaotic, nihilistic trickster character from other unrelated media. For example, Jinx from Arcane, the Netflix show, is a direct copycat of the Joker. Is basically the Joker mixed with Harley Quinn. And also characters I referred to in the last video, such as Rick from Rick and Morty, the taxi driver, Patrick Bateman from American Psycho, and a dozen different anime characters. The Joker is iconic because he's a fun version of what most people see as a nihilist. A character that knows and sees the ultimate truth of the world and society, and for thrills seeks to show the ugly nature of the world through brazen and seemingly senseless acts of violence.
I'll show you. When the chips are down, these civilized people, they'll eat each other.
Along with a high chaotic intellect, far superior than any of his peers, a ruthless rejection of social norms, and a charismatic persona free from conventions, the Joker is an edgelord power fantasy. He is kind of a universal power fantasy to an extent, or he wouldn't be as popular as he is in the mainstream. But he works well for edgelords because he champions and enfranchises an antisocial behavioral model that is admirable from his perspective. However, I've come to realize that within the same universe, we have really a much more useful and probably accurate icon of an edgelord fantasy and behavior and ideology, and that's in the Joker's clear counterpart, Batman himself. Batman has been in a weird spot for the last few years, or I guess maybe even the last decade at this point, as people have begun to deconstruct exactly what Batman is in a modern social climate that is more critical of ultra-rich white men and more empathetic to criminals, especially criminals with mental illnesses. Batman is a billionaire who wants to fight crime. And instead of investing in infrastructure and public health and economics in his community, he breaks the legs of petty criminals. This is an unfair oversimplification, of course, but that's part of Batman's discourse right now. This discussion on why is this what he chooses to spend his time doing? Which is why the newest Batman movie, The Batman, did a lot of work to engage with how to perceive and deal with Batman as a hero in the current political moment. To do this, they openly admit one of Batman's most controversial truths, that Batman is a big old edgelord. Batman is popular because he represents the idealized image of what most edgelords see themselves as, but unlike the Joker, he's the hero. And, this is important, he's also much more traditionally masculine. While the Joker has had girlfriends in some iterations, he's also been basically asexual in others, while the Batman is physically imposing, rich, respected, and irresistible to his various female paramours. With no hint, as far as I know, that Batman is anything above a 2 on the Kinsey scale when it comes to attraction. Batman and Joker are two sides of the same coin.
You complete me.
The Joker is just evil, and within his nihilistic endeavors, he seeks to spread his ideology of the meaningless of life and society through violence. In many stories, the Joker's goal is to take away the normative social structures that people have that he believes keep them from acting like animals. Batman is in many iterations also a nihilist, but seeks to maintain order and justice just as the thing he wants to do because he's the opposite of Joker. I don't read a lot of Batman, y'all, so I'm probably missing something, but fuck you, I don't care. There's some much deeper discourses to have on the philosophical implications of these characters, but I want to focus on how their identities work and why they're appealing to edgelords. And the movie gives us really everything we need to break this down by forcing its version of Batman to recognize that for all of his efforts to be vengeance and spread justice, he's done kind of the opposite and become a symbol for other unhinged edgelords to create more chaos and more destruction. The villain of this movie, the Riddler, is modeled after a clear reference to your stereotypical self-important Reddit edgelord, seeking to strike back at a society that he feels has wronged him.
I'm giving you a chance. No one ever gave me a chance.
In a fashion not all that apart from how Batman moves. The Riddler sees himself and Batman as kindred spirits, because even though Batman doesn't overtly attack society indiscriminately, he also clearly feels above it and beyond its authority, or he wouldn't be working so brazenly outside its laws and expectations to pursue his goals. And it is understandable and relatable to not put your faith into society and social structures, acting in a way that is fair and just to you or to society as a whole. I think that makes perfect sense. I, as a black man, know this firsthand from numerous experiences that the way the rules are supposed to work and the way the rules actually work can be very different depending on the circumstances. The Riddler in the movie has his own reasons to feel the same way. The Joker kind of does and kind of doesn't. His character doesn't always have a backstory on purpose. And of course, the Batman has his very classic story of watching his parents die in a senseless act of violence and recognizing that society will not give him the justice he requires for their deaths. So in terms of this very edgy concept of we live in a society, the baseline of that makes perfect sense from a lot of reasonable perspectives. Myself and the Riddler and Batman, and even to an extent the Joker, wanting to reject societal pressures and barriers in order to pursue what you think is right, I think that's something anybody can relate to. But it also connects to what I think is an important axiom of the edgelord identity, again, regardless of one's political affiliation, which is that being an edgelord is a frame for these boys and young men to reclaim a sense of power in a society that has in some way made them feel disempowered. Batman, or moreover Bruce Wayne, is very reasonably scarred by the trauma of witnessing his parents' murder. This event, like any event of childhood trauma, makes him feel disempowered, and he seeks to reclaim this power in the form of the Batman. Batman exhibits wholly antisocial behavior and wanton violence. He develops a nonsensical ethical code to absolve himself of the responsibility for enacting this violence on numerous people. And worst of all, he fabricates this sense of self-importance that positions him as some type of virtuous warrior of truth, providing what the world really needs through his righteous actions.
As a man, I'm flesh and blood. I can be ignored, I can be destroyed, but as a symbol, I can be incorruptible.
And within universe and many Batman stories, again, not an expert on Batman, you see that most everyone else kind of sees him as a weirdo and a loose cannon who at some point in time is probably going to be a danger to everybody else. Batman fails at developing productive interpersonal relationships in almost all of his iterations, never being close to anyone as Batman or Bruce Wayne, mostly due, again, to his single-minded focus on what he sees is a noble goal and his inability to function as a well-adjusted adult. an inability, again, shaped by unresolved childhood trauma. The Center for Disease Control has a lot of research on ACEs, aka adverse childhood experiences. Numerous studies show that there are direct correlations between adverse childhood experiences and a number of negative behaviors and mental health outcomes, such as perpetrating and being victimized by violence, mental illness, substance abuse.
It's stimulating, mind expanding. It's the in thing, the hula hoop of the jet generation.
ACEs includes things that are very common experiences for edgelords, such as being a victim of bullying or sexual abuse, neglect, social isolation, or actual pre-existing mental illnesses.
I felt very disempowered. And I had like a bunch of problems going on around the time too, like family-wise. And it was around that time where like I just, amidst my family, I felt like I was just fading into the background. And it comes like how I think of addressing people in these situations. Like, yeah, some of the things that they believe are just abhorrent. Like they are just truly awful, but everyone gets to that point somehow. You know, it's like they say, no one is born evil. It's just something that people are formed into. Everyone has a story. They all reach that point in some way. And usually along that journey, there is some pain, and that pain has to be validated regardless of how it comes about.
So it's not hard to see how Batman fits into the Edgelord framework. What makes him special is that he's the ultimate embodiment of what an Edgelord kind of imagines themselves to be when they're being an asshole on Reddit or in the comments section. One of my favorite illustrations of Batman as an edgelord comes from the Crisis on Two Earths animated DC Comics movie. In this movie, the regular Justice League, Superman, Flash, etc. meets what's basically an evil Justice League from an alternate dimension. Hijinks ensue, and eventually we realize that Batman's evil twin, Owlman, is planning to destroy the entire universe. Why? Because we live in a society. No, basically that's his thing. It's a motivation actually very common in gaming and comics and anime. The cataclysmic nihilist villain who sees the only path for truth and justice for humanity to be its destruction.
Man is a cancer, and I've chosen to cut out the disease. You're talking about killing everyone who ever lived, whoever will live. I choose to make the only possible real choice.
It's also a very common motivating ethos you can find in the writings of mostly white spree shooters. This idea that humanity and society is so broken and so rotten that the only fair and righteous option is to find a way to destroy it and maybe rebuild it from the ground up. Thankfully, spree shooters only have guns and not doomsday bombs or hundreds of thousands of giants and stone walls. Yes, we'll come to that later. The final confrontation between Batman and Owlman is so profoundly insightful to me of the ethos of edgelords that it's hard to imagine that it's on accident. It has to be intentional. And it's a perfect commentary on that flawed ethos. Maybe until the very end of it, I don't know, I'll let you decide. So they're stuck here on this planet, and Owlman has the big bomb that's going to blow up the whole universe. And he explains to Batman his very trite and common purpose of destroying all life because we live in society and blah, 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 blah. Batman tries to reason with him and stop him. And Owlman reads Batman pretty clearly, pointing out that Batman's entire being is filled with the same rage and anger and hatred for society, and that he wonders out loud what tragedy befell Batman for him to become the same way that Owlman was.
What terrible wrong was done to set you on this path?
But after all that, Batman eventually gets the upper hand and is getting ready to win the battle, and he ends it with this line.
There is a difference between you and me. We both looked into the abyss. But when it looked back at us, you blinked.
This, of course, is a reference to that soy boy Nietzsche that I totally owned in the Black Boyhood video. Nietzsche famously said, "Beware that when fighting monsters, you yourself do not become a monster. For when you gaze long into the abyss gazes also into you." Nietzsche is a very popular figure among edgelords and the neo-Nazi movement because he's one of the most influential thinkers in the philosophy of nihilism. I won't act like I have a strong understanding of nihilism, but I think I'm solid in saying that the core theme of nihilism is that nothing, not even human life, has any intrinsic meaning or value.
Nothing matters.
Yes, I know I probably am saying Nietzsche's name wrong, and While nihilism often evokes images of dreary edgelords with poor attitudes and antisocial behavior, it seems that this is really not how nihilism is meant to work as a philosophy in terms of being this defining value through which one should live life and experience the world. An editorial published in the Harvard Crimson had the following to say about nihilism. You see, nihilists can be broken into two specific groups. The first are the passive nihilists. These are individuals who, when faced with the realization that existence has no inherent meaning, can fall into a deep depression as a result. This is an act of resignation. The passive nihilist no longer sees any purpose in life, and his mental and physical condition suffer as a result. And this is the kind of nihilism we should avoid. However, there exists another group of nihilists, the active nihilists. An active nihilist is someone who, when confronted with the exact same realization, rejoices at the freedom that it gives them. If there were a specific meaning to human life, then each of us will be bound to follow it. But if there is not, then we all have the freedom to decide the purpose of our own lives. In fact, we are required to do so if we wish to avoid the pit of passive nihilism. So one active nihilist might conclude that the purpose of their life is to combat poverty across the globe. Another might commit themselves to protecting the environment. Active nihilists have tremendous freedom in determining the best way to live their own lives. So it seems to me that our men blinked and thus adopted an understanding of nihilism that almost seeks to punish the world for having no intrinsic meaning. But the Chad Batman stared into the abyss, did not blink, and came out of it in an active state of nihilism that he would decide that his life is to be dedicated to fighting for justice and vengeance. Nihilism and Nietzsche are popular among edgelords as both were basic tools to engage with the rejection of organized religion, the first major target of the early skeptic communities on YouTube.
We chose to accept reality. You can't prove God doesn't exist. Yes, we already did. God don't fucking exist.
The open rejection of society and societal norms and morals gives nihilists, and by proxy edgelords, a genuine sense that they can reclaim agency and power by deciding for themselves what is and what is not important. If you think about the places where many edgelords come from, the outskirts of social efficacy, maybe they're less affable, less charismatic, less attractive, less rich, etc., it makes sense that a philosophy that is built to say that you get to define for yourself what is and isn't important will be very attractive and appealing. But the question still is, why do they spend so much time deciding that they're not going to pursue what's important to them, but they're going to actively try to destroy what's important to others? Coming back to Batman and the Joker, we see the real problem here. A lot of edgelords are operating in a passive nihilism. The acknowledgement that life has no meaning, no morals, and no intrinsic sense of value has left them much more like Owlman, the Riddler, and the Joker.
The only sensible way to live in this world is without rules.
Instead of finding useful ways to take their newfound freedom of mind to pursue something that is important, they seek vengeance. They want to punish the world for ever tricking them into believing in it in the first place, especially if they felt like said world ostracized or punished them for not being able to perform the appropriate type of social interaction that they were ostracized for. They see this as a way to reclaim a sense of power that is denied to them, but not other young boys and men who don't have the aces and the barriers and the social stigmas that they had. This desire for power to correct or to take revenge on a thing, to me, doesn't seem very nihilistic. It seems that you really care a lot, that this is something that does have value, that is important to you. But you see this concept of nihilism still being championed among edgelords. As I mentioned in the old Edgelord video, there are countless examples of these types of characters in various forms of media, from books to anime to movie to comics. And the irony is that often these characters are meant to be deconstructions of this type of behavior, to show that this type of behavior is a problem and not a virtue. But far too often, the edgelords themselves don't get it. They don't see the problem.
Yeah, they're taking a Fight Club as a manifesto and not just like a pretty badass movie about a secretly queer romance.
I am Jackson Flame's sense of rejection.
Most definitely. Yeah, Travis Bickle, like it was like, because the thing is, I went into that movie expecting to really like Travis Bickle. Just see him as like a man on the edges that like reclaims his power. But then like I watched it, and you know, it gradually unfolds like this guy is fucking awful. Like he's clearly got PTSD that's unaddressed. He just is just a generally terrible person, and he's, even though he like puts efforts into self-improvement and everything, it's all for the wrong reasons. The writer of that movie, Paul Schrader, if I remember right, I remember an interview with him that like really stuck out, and that was him talking about like how a character like Travis Bickle is a message to all of the young men out there who think that their pain is unique and that it makes them special among the world, and it should be recognized as special, that you should know that your pain isn't unique. And the sooner that you come to terms with that and actually address it, the sooner you can actually become a well-rounded, happier man.
They themselves still feel too disempowered to understand that Travis Bickle and Dee Fins and Arthur Fleck are not heroes. They are not to be idolized and looked up to. And that if you want to go down this route, then at least be Batman. But that kind of reveals a complex problem here. Travis Bickle, Dee Fins, Fleck, and most of these characters are, for the most part, losers. They're failures on numerous levels, professionally, romantically, economically, etc. They suffer from their trauma in ways that makes any ability for them to advance in life difficult or impossible. Their acts of violence give them importance and grandiosity in a way that they could never achieve through more normative and appropriate means. And then the movies further make the mistake of aggrandizing them despite all of this through surges of music and cool lighting and awesome costume designs and hero shots. In the last video, a lot of people argued with me that it's completely obvious for Arthur Fleck in the last Joker movie to not be seen as a hero, that he is hallucinating. And I genuinely agree with that. But to a young mind, to a burgeoning edgelord, to a person looking to adopt this identity, thinking it might give them power, that last shot on the taxi cab of him dancing triumphantly, it doesn't really give away that this is a bad thing. It very easily could be interpreted as a great thing, that he is victorious in what he did. The narrative and analysis supposedly tells us that these characters are wrong and are losers. But when you look at the way that they're framed, and surely you see the way that many people talk about them in the aftermath, they see it as aspirational and, to the average edgy boy, attainable. These guys find power in rejecting appropriate social behavior, and they exert that power by openly flouting this rejection. They say things that they know bother people and then deride them for being triggered. They indulge in lewd images, some of minors, and let you know that there's nothing that you can do about it. They hide behind anime avatars on Twitter and do whatever they can to openly antagonize others who, in their opinion, are foolishly fighting to make the world a better place and are being too sensitive to things that are just jokes. They're just kind of awful on purpose. And in their minds, their awfulness is the truth. It's the right thing to do in a shitty world. And they're fucking miserable because the reality is all of this is one big cope. Because they aren't Batman, they aren't even Owlman. They're who the Joker really would be in a real world situation. They're fucking losers, but it's not that simple. And we need to be more empathetic than to just say that outright. Take Bruce Wayne, the billionaire, playboy genius, super athlete, super inventor that looks like a male model. Of course, Batman can operate in an active space of nihilism. He has everything else he might need to assuage the negative elements of his childhood trauma. His edgelord persona is Nietzsche's Ubermensch, and it's not attainable to Arthur Fleck, the deranged murderer and stalker, or Dee Fins, the sad, bitter, short, ugly divorcee who's being laid off. Even among other white men, and here's where we'll start to get maybe into the danger zone. It's important to note that there is a greater element of privilege for a Batman versus a Joker. It's physical, it's economic, and it's structural. The Riddler even calls him out for this in the movie.
Do you know what being an orphan is? It's 30 kids to a room. 12 years old and already a drop-in, numbing the pain. You wake up screaming with rats, chewing your fingers. And every winter, one of the babies die because it's so cold. But oh no. Let's talk about the billionaire with the lying dead daddy, because at least the money makes it go down easy, doesn't it?
Insinuating that he was stupid for ever thinking that maybe Bruce Wayne would see or understand the world the way he did. And this is a major flaw in the way we talk about edgelords and white men in general, and really all men for the most part, when we're trying to assess and analyze certain problems across gender. While there is a protective layer of race and gender privilege for all white men compared to everyone else, the analysis and difference between rich and poor white men, able-bodied and disabled white men, neurotypical and atypical men, or even just good-looking and not good-looking, we haven't went there enough. We've left that entire portion of this discourse, of this analysis, I'll say, under-leveled. And again, for a good reason. I understand why. A lot of us are a bit too busy fighting our own liberation to think too hard or too effectively on the liberation of white men from the same systems that privilege them the most. And it feels fucking stupid, and in many cases like a complete waste of time, to engage with white men and boys in conversations that analyzes and breaks down elements of their lived experiences and identities the same way we often do our own, because they don't really have that muscle a lot of time. It's hard for them to even start down that path initially, because it basically requires them to completely reframe their understanding of the world and the self to even start to make sense of it. But it's to a point where we've greatly fallen behind, where even though we do have a ton of cis-het white men in this space on the left, the actual explicit analysis on whiteness and maleness is lacking, and it's even lacking also in academia. If I were a normal 13-year-old white boy and I was struggling socially, or I was struggling emotionally, or I was struggling with an ACE, an adverse childhood experience, and maybe I'm a product of white habitus. So even though I don't outwardly hate or take issue with people of other races or queer people or women, I also don't quite have the best filters for recognizing harmful and aggressive beliefs about those groups. Maybe I'm into anime or gaming because those spaces make me feel good and those communities affirm me and give me a sense of belonging and identity that I don't get in other social spaces. Whatever the case, if I was looking for help and I was looking for something to aid me in a way that made sense from my specific, unique intersection among people that I tend to trust, unless there was someone like truly there to aid me right on time in a specific journey into a progressive and useful, like, emotional framework, I'd probably end up in the manosphere.
When I think like what really scares me in people nowadays, it's like, it's not necessarily hatred or fear, because I think hatred and fear both have like, they both have antidotes, you know? Nihilism is what scares me in young dudes the most nowadays, because I think the moment that like people do start, particularly young white dudes, do start embracing that nothingness, that to me is where all the really dark shit can grow. And that is what I try and push back on in kind of like a lot of my videos in a weird way. But I think it's that absence of belief that I think makes such a fertile ground for all the shit that we've been talking about. It's that absence of belief that I think makes such a fertile ground for all the shit that we've been talking about.
Brother needed a moment there. Had to get right a little bit. Needed a moment to collect my thoughts and process what this video is really going to be. I've talked about being a high school teacher before. It's a formative experience in terms of like who I am today. Of my 10 years teaching, the vast majority of that time was spent teaching underserved Black youth. But I did spend 1 year, my first year teaching actually, at a predominantly white school. It wasn't super white, maybe like 65%, with a mix of Black and Latino children making up the rest. But it was pretty, diverse. And actually very economically diverse. And being around that many white kids, that was new. And moreover, this was my first experience with white poverty. I knew white poverty was a thing, of course, but I hadn't engaged with kids who were legit living in trailers, whose parents were meth heads, who suffered under late capitalism, just like the Black kids I had taught. It was a sobering learning experience to figure out the different nuances for the many white boys that, for good or ill, took a liking to me. It wasn't always fun. The microaggressions were pretty strong, but it was a change I was up for. I had this one kid who was brilliant. He was the type of kid that would sleep through your entire class, wake up, and then get 100 on your quiz. I would hand him instructions for an assignment, and at the end of class, instead of handing me the assignment, he would hand me back the instructions with psychedelic art doodles all over it. It was a challenge. It was my first year teaching, so I didn't really know how to address that effectively, but I got him past the class and we bonded through that. It was a good experience. I really appreciated that time with that kid. Sadly, the intense racism of that school was too much for me, and I left after 1 year. Still, I made enough of an impression that years later, this kid looked me up on Facebook. Instead of being in college, being brilliant, he had gotten into landscaping or something, and it was cool. We had a chat or two. He was one of many students I kept contact with from that school, and I'm pretty sure he was the second to commit suicide. In my 10 years of teaching, I've lost maybe a dozen students, either during school, like while they were in school, or in the preceding years. And around half of that number is from this 1 year that I taught at this white school. The Black students I've lost have been to accidents. One was murdered. One did complete suicide after committing a felony. But most of that 12, white kids, white boys in particular, almost all of them suicides with an overdose or two mixed in. This experience has always haunted me. I don't blame myself per se, because I was only there for a year, but I just can't imagine how so many kids from one school could be gone before they turn 25 from self-harm. I've taught and worked with some Black boys and men in the most dire of conditions, coming from the most toxic environments. And I had a solid understanding of what that looked like and how that worked and what to do. But for these boys, I just didn't get it, still don't get it. But I care. And I cared then. And on some levels, that put me in an awkward position, both back then and now. There's an internal sense of cognitive dissonance that I need to engage with here, constantly checking myself on whether what I'm doing, what I'm talking about, is what I want to do or what I should do or what people will approve of. So there might be a few of you that judge me or look at me sideways for being naturally empathetic to, a group of people that, are deserving of your empathy. These very lost, very confused, and unfortunately, if nothing happens, very dangerous young white men who are kind of wrapped in these cycles and the alt-right pipeline, if you will. We usually see the end result of it, and we know how it happens, but I don't know if there's a useful breakdown of the predisposition required to get there. And it feels weird for me to be the one to investigate that. One response I get in a lot of my content, a response I think a lot of Black people get whenever they talk about race in public, is that, we just are bitter against white people and we hate white people and all this stuff. And no, that's not the case. I'm bitter at racism. I hate racism. Now, the concept of racism and whiteness as a class structure are intrinsically linked, but the people who embody that status are still people. There's still so much nuance and depth and variance among people, so much to appreciate and in many cases empathize with. And that is sometimes hard because on many an occasion, Black people have seen our empathy for others be exploited. And so it's safer and easier to reserve said empathy for our own. It took me a second to get comfortable with the uncle moniker that I've grown to love. Please believe it's not without its baggage. There's a magical Negro discourse that I manage internally as I make content, especially content like this, where it surrounds a subject and population that I can't trust to fully understand the delicate balance of talking about race in mixed company. Some that might dismiss what I'm saying from their own space of ignorance outright, or still not get it on so many levels and need more explaining, more things that I'm just not always interested in giving. And at the same time, there's a portion of my fan base and even some of my peers who resent the idea that I bother engaging on issues that aren't explicitly Black centered, that I'm wasting my time and attention and platform by explaining racism to white people. And there's definitely truth in that response as well. And so I kind of pick and choose when I feel like getting into certain topics based on the level of emotional labor I'm going to need to deal with the production and the aftermath. And please believe I wouldn't call this a labor of love. The request to make a Manosphere video has been charged to me a lot since I came on the scene, especially a video addressing the growth of the Black Manosphere. And I didn't want to do that shit. I did not feel like ever doing this video. I'm keeping it 100. Fuck all these dudes.
Fuck all you hoes. Get a grip, motherfucker.
This video essay
is dedicated to all the
Manosphere
that told me I never amount to nothing.
Fuck this one, that one, those two, all these guys. I really don't want anything to do with them, their content, and especially their fan bases, but welcome. I'm sure you're here.
It's all good, baby.
To me, talking about them specifically legitimizes them and gives them both attention and fodder to make more content in a lot of cases. I've always been more focused on talking about the topics and talking directly to the audiences that we both share. But I'm positive that if this video gets any traction, that it will end up in their circulation. So, you know, if you're here and you're just a big fan of Fresh and Fit or something, just turn the video off right here. Just dislike this shit. Dislike and just leave. It's okay. No, actually don't. I need to keep the checks coming. I got babies to feed. That said, when I started interviewing these other creators about Edgelord stuff, the conversations always started to veer away, specifically from Edgelord issues and other silly things, to explicitly looking at modern conflicts of masculinity. And as I was writing, I knew that maybe this would end up being that Manosphere video I had been avoiding this whole time. And really, that should have been obvious because all of this Edgelord shit is birthed out of conflicts of masculinity in young boys who feel emasculated and disempowered by the world around them and are seeking to reclaim it through Edgelord behavior. And all of that comes back to performing gender, performing masculinity. These young men and boys feel slighted and marginalized by society regardless of race, and they find ways to reclaim that sense of power and agency. Like, you don't see a ton of conventionally attractive men deep into Edgelord activity. There's a lot of reasons why Hassan has set himself apart from the rest of the political streamer economy and is clearly not a big Edgelord like many of his peers, and thus greatly transcends the success of that space. And yes, this is something that I wasn't fully aware of in the Break Bread video. I apologize, players fuck up. But no shade to Hassan, who calls himself a himbo. One reason why he's so successful that I'm sure he'd admit is that he is obviously conventionally attractive, which amplifies other elements of his appeal to a wider audience, both male, female, queer, straight, poly, non-binary, whatever tags you identify with. If you are attracted to men, you're probably attracted to Hassan.
Hassan is probably the most attractive.
So I guess my first would be Hassan.
I think that he has a very nice body.
I guess Hassan's the hottest one.
He's cute.
Oh. He's really good looking. I've seen this one. Oh my god. Oh my god.
And Hassan is just really, really super hot.
I just want to be his friend, dude.
I just want to know him.
I just want to suck his dick, dude. That's all.
Why did you make Will watch this? This is like terrible.
Hello, darkness, my old friend.
Part of this is because Hassan is closer to what sociologist R.W. Connell would call ideal hegemonic masculinity. Yeah, so we're going into the theory and history part of the essay. So if you don't care about the actual foundational knowledge about the shit I'm about to talk and just want to hear me shit on Gary Vee and other manosphere figures, go ahead, skip ahead. It's in the description, but you're not going to learn any new big words. I've said the term hegemonic a few times in this and other videos, so it's really important that I probably give some context to explain that. The term hegemony is a really significant term in the world of critical theory and comes from Italian Marxist philosopher Antonio Gramsci, and is basically a concept that explains how society and culture and the state dominates the frameworks through which we understand and see the world, and also how we expect the world and society to work, look, and function. Gramsci states,
what we can do for the moment is to fix two major superstructural levels. The one that can be called civil society, that is the ensemble of organisms commonly called private, and that of political society, or the state. These two levels correspond on the one hand to the function of hegemony, which the dominant group exercises throughout society, and on the other hand to that of direct domination, or command exercised through the state and judicial government.
cultural hegemony and hegemonic thinking is really the bane of so much socially ingrained injustice that seems to be impossible to avoid, no matter your identity. It's what causes comments that say man should never order fruity drinks, or that a woman who has a good job has masculine energy. Like the whole conversation right now about unions and about whether or not people deserve a livable wage is a hegemonic concept ingrained very much here in America, that somehow people that don't work hard enough should starve to death. That's an ideology we don't question, we just kind of take as true, as an axiom. That's what hegemony does. It gives you ideas that you just take as fact because that's the way it should be, without thinking about the fact that we kind of get to choose what is and what isn't in our society. And there's a Foucault quote in there somewhere about the panopticon and Durkheim on organic solidarity. This next section is going to be full of, look, I read the old white folks books stuff, so just bear with me. Hegemony is very much socially constructed and thus is subject to change, meaning that we agree as a society that, I don't know, dreadlocks are not professional. We'll come back to that in a second. Even though there's no explicit reason to think of how someone wears a hairstyle as indicative of their ability to work a particular job. But sadly, many people treat social constructions such as hair and fashion and gender as immutable and natural things, and will fight for them even when the fight doesn't really involve them, in order to maintain a natural order, in order to maintain hegemony. This brings us to the concept of hegemonic masculinity, crafted by sociologist R.W. Connell with support by James Messerschmidt. Simply put, Connell took the concept of hegemony and expanded it to the performance of masculinity, i.e., what culturally idealized and prescribed features should a person performing masculinity have. Again, these things change from culture to culture, space to space, and time to time. Black men in America who are marginalized because of race still have a framework of masculinity within community that they adhere to and aspire to, and is different from what white men do or Latino men do, or what black men might do in other parts of the world, or what they did 20 years ago in a lot of ways. Even among queer men, there's going to be nuances and a hierarchy around what a good man is and what a good man is not. And yes, there is a feminine counterpart, but this video is long enough. But it's basically pick me. It's not that hard to get. Another foundational concept that I want to bring up is what Connell calls the patriarchal dividend. This is a fancier way of saying the material or psychological manifestation of male privilege. All men, and yes, that includes not just white, but BIPOC, queer, trans, etc. men, benefit on some level from our patriarchal system, some obviously much more than others. No matter how much they align with women, no matter how they vote, no matter the various other intersections through which patriarchy may also hurt them, within a patriarchal society, there will always be a continuum of privilege between men and non-men. That is the patriarchal dividend. But the thing is, for some men, especially men who clearly are very close to the aforementioned masculine ideal, aka someone like Hassan, or some of these men can often feel like what they're getting isn't what they're really owed, that they're not getting enough of that patriarchal dividend. They feel like they're doing the right things, performing masculinity in the appropriate way, upholding the appropriate values, but they don't see the results they believe they're supposed to get. They're not getting the job, they're not getting the girl, they're not getting the respect. There's a specific feeling that comes from this that sociologist Michael Kimmel calls aggrieved entitlement. And I want to quickly mention that Kimmel, who is one of the more prominent figures in masculine studies in sociology, has in the past few years had his own rash of accusations of workplace bullying and sexism, the irony of which is not lost on me. However, his work still stands as some of the more insightful academic texts in the studies of masculinities. Quick aside, none of the great thinkers that provide us with some of the more important academic theories are without fault or with bad takes. Bell Hooks had more than a few bad takes on black men that did not age well and really hated Beyonce. Was not a fan. W.E.B. Du Bois was a proponent of eugenics later in his life, and Karl Marx was a fuckboy. So stop deifying the theorists. Let's just rock with the theory as much as it is useful to us. And so that's what we're going to do here. Kimmel describes aggrieved entitlement as a sense of shame and frustration and eventually rage that comes from men who feel like their patriarchal dividend has been denied in some way. He states,
"That shame and humiliation underlie basically all violence. Because I feel small, I will make you feel smaller." In my interviews with extremists, both actives and formers, I have found time and time again that they've experienced that sense of humiliation and shame. At least in the case of the German, Swedish, and American guys that I interviewed, sometimes it is not really political at all. Many of them, especially the American guys, were sexually abused, beat up, bullied as children. Some of them have basically the same sort of profile as the victims of Catholic priests. Growing up, they were deeply ashamed of themselves. They didn't do well in school. They didn't have friends. They were sad, miserable, and they escaped into themselves. That just made them better targets, and the far right drew them in.
I'm going to interchangeably refer to aggrieved entitlement and main character syndrome because they're kind of the same thing. It's just one was said by a big sociologist, but you get the gist of it, I hope. I'm bringing these concepts up because they are fundamental and really important concepts for explaining and exploring the manosphere from my perspective. The manosphere is a loose network of mostly online communities and media entities with a wide variety of ideologies and styles and arguments, but all of them agree with one major core tenet, which is that modern men are in a state of crisis, and 9 times out of 10, the next thing they'll say is because of women. And before I get into all the ways in which they're wrong about many things, I want to point out as a whole that these men are definitely correct to at least feel like something is wrong. Men of all races are in a state of crisis, and for white men, this crisis is made more complicated by the emergence of widely accepted critical theories such as postmodernism, intersectional feminism, critical race theory, etc., that are reframing the way we understand race and gender, slowly eroding at the hegemonic space of power for them for the first time in modern history. It's no wonder that you'll hear of those philosophical movements I just mentioned as dangerous to civilization. For the first time in history, some white men have something they've never really had before: fear of social repercussions, aka accountability. Between Me Too and cancel culture and camera phones, etc., white men for the first time have to at least think about the consequences of acting upon their racial and gender privilege. They need to make sure no one has camera phones when they throw their racist frat parties. They need to think about what they're going to say on live streams in case something gets clipped out of context. They need to make sure that the group text chats full of racist and sexist conversations don't have their real names on it. Now, in reality, all of this doesn't amount to a lot of real material differences for everyone else. Getting 1 or 2 white men fired from their job or embarrassed and dragged online for being racist is not really the revolution we've been working towards, and definitely not the great replacement that many white men seem to fear. But there's this old saying that when you're used to privilege, equity can feel like oppression. And that's what we see and get from so many white reactionary manosphere type spaces. They don't understand this feeling of essentially being racialized as white men and understanding that it means something that maybe it didn't mean just a few years ago. However, it's deeper than that. One thing that we need to be far more critical of is the fact that all men, including white men, are dealing with numerous challenges that have eroded at their mental, physical, and economic health over the last 30 plus years or so. Many of you probably are aware that white men account for a disparate amount of suicides in America, with some studies having them responsible for up to 70% of suicides in the States. In UK, men's suicides are over 3 times as likely than for women. And rates of suicide in the UK and the US have risen over the last 20 years greatly because of the suicide of white men. Suicide strongly correlates to social issues and economics and health. So white men notwithstanding, suicide rates for Native Americans, the disabled, queer, and queer youth are higher than any other population, which should provide some perspective on the real structural issues in our society and how that erodes on our mental health. However, with those populations, I think we have some understanding as to why that's the case. We know why queer people and queer youth turn to self-harm in a society that constantly prosecutes them. We have well-developed understandings for these disparities. For white men who occupy such a clear space of privilege in the US, and I'm sure in the UK as well, why is there such a disparity? Why are these boys and men killing themselves while at least on paper they should have way less to be concerned about? The data and research points to things like mental illness, substance addiction, as well as economic and social instability, and an absence of effective coping mechanisms, often exacerbated by an adherence to classical views of masculinity. Suicide among white men is more common in rural areas, which have higher poverty, as well as higher access to guns and lower access to quality health care. Yet, and you all know this, these same rural areas vote against any and all progressive policies that might help them because they, like most of America, are very conservative, because conservatism in America is part of their hegemony, at least in a specific demonstrable sense. And this is the enduring paradox of the crisis of men. There is a hegemonic hold that often has to be severed first, or at least greatly weakened, before boys and men are able to actually deal with the problems they all face, which is living as men under late capitalism, being the gears in a capitalist patriarchal system that benefits them, definitely, but also consumes them as fuel. Ian Danskin describes this in his alt-right playbook series, specifically on the video How to Radicalize a Normie.
Gabe has concerns like economic precarity, not knowing his place in a changing world, stressful working conditions. In other words, Gabe is suffering under late capitalism, same as everyone.
Pretty much all the things that are said there to be plaguing men, especially white men, can be explained through understanding the exploitative nature of capitalism and how men play a specific and important role in the maintenance of capitalism, a role that for the vast majority of them requires a traumatizing debasement of their sense of self and humanity. Men have to be the arbiters and vectors of patriarchal power. Patriarchy does not work with our support. We are the glue that keeps that machine together. But consider how glue is made. I'm reminded of Boxer from George Orwell's Animal Farm. Long story short, the animals are the proletariat and the pigs are the bourgeois, and you should really read the book. It's like 100 pages long. It's a good one. Boxer is a horse, and he is the strongest and hardest working of all the other animals. He neglects his physical health as well as his intellectual development to focus on his role of being the workhorse, which is an esteemed and valued role that brings some admiration and respect from his peers, even though as he works harder, he is slowly destroying his body. He does this without question because he believes that in the end, the pigs who have all the real power will reward him for his toil and dedication in the social order that he's helped build, that is impossible to create without his help. This is the plight of men right now. Much like Boxer, many men are intensely aligned and committed to the hegemonic belief system that their performance of their role in society gives them rewards and will give them their patriarchal dividend, will make them the main character of their story. And much like Boxer, they are guaranteed nothing, no matter what they do, unless of course they can somehow find themselves a pathway to the top of the hierarchy, which very, very few men of any race are capable of doing when they have to actually start from scratch. And the manosphere in various ways offers the false promise of fixing this problem, of making you a man so great that you'll definitely get the dividend you've always wanted. The promise of giving you a map to be the main character that you've always wanted to be. This messaging works because these boys and men, whether they're edgelords or good-looking petite bourgeois boys of relative privilege, feel the squeeze, feel the sense of existential dread, and they want to address it. They want to address what are actually the failures and limitations of patriarchy under capitalism with performing patriarchy under capitalism. So today we have men from Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, and soon to be Gen Alpha, as the oldest of them are entering puberty and are going to start Googling shit on YouTube and TikTok. And they're going to be grappling with the concept of performing masculinity and fearing the possibility of failing at it and suffering numerous consequences, or succeeding and suffering other consequences. And that's one thing I also want to get across here, is that much of the manosphere historically and now is built upon a fear response. As boys, we fear that poor performance of masculinity can contribute to bullying and ostracism, which it does. As men, we fear that it will lead to low prospects for intimate partnership and professional success, which it does. Then for a lot of men who ostensibly do perform masculinity effectively, unless they are at the top of the food chain, they will still be susceptible to the harms of late capitalism in the form of exploitative and dehumanizing work, low wages, poor health practices, etc. And even those at the top of the top still have to contend with the erosion of their soul. This is the infected foundation underneath all of this nonsense that ties it all together and makes the manosphere seem to have such widespread reach, as it makes it possible for someone to start out just wanting to build some muscle or learn how to talk to girls or searching for their favorite anime character and end up arguing for things like enforced monogamy, sex redistribution, or that women should be denied the right to vote. The scary and hard thing to understand is that, like most social ills, the worst parts of the manosphere stem from a very valid and very universal sense of anguish in men. And we have to contend with and process this if we are ever going to seriously address how to fix the problems that the manosphere presents to us. Up until now, I've mostly been talking only about white men and boys. And while there is plenty of diversity in all of these groups, there are some distinct differences in what most refer to as the Black Manosphere, which has grown a lot in terms of visibility in the last few years with figures like Kevin Samuels and kind of Fresh and Fit. I'll get to that later. That said, the Black Manosphere is not new, and to be fair, at least on YouTube, it's probably been around a lot longer in its current state than its white counterparts. And I think it's important to parse out some of these differences before moving on, because we want to keep in mind that these two groups definitely converge in some areas, but separate in others. Unlike its white counterpart, the Black Manosphere has the benefit of being able to subterfuge a lot of its elements under the guise of pro-Black thought and political discourse. Many, not all, but many of the figures in the Black Manosphere present themselves as pro-Black political figures and talking heads in conjunction with being male advocates. And they just happen to peddle conservative, misogynistic, and every once in a while homophobic rhetoric as solutions to the issues that Black people face.
I'm just saying to anybody, we can't be pro-Black if you are, how are you pro-Black and not married? This is my issue with a lot of the pro-Black movement, especially a lot of pro-Black women. I need to see your husband.
The insecurities and frustrations for Black men that attract them to the manosphere is pretty much the same as their white counterparts, except that those frustrations, the financial insecurity, the ugly breakups and divorces, child custody battles, etc., are all made a bit more complicated by structural racism. And along with that, because of structural racism, they also are dealing with high death rates, lower access to healthcare, and barriers to a lot of the ways that the manosphere preaches for seeking self-help. Historically, the nature of patriarchy has mostly excluded Black men in a traditional sense. Black men as a whole have never fully encapsulated the patriarchal image of father knows best, doting wife, 2 kids, and a dog. Even those Black men that did have those things were always still barred from the full essence of what that framework was supposed to offer in terms of respect and stability. You can be Black and be the man of the house and the man in your neighborhood, but you were still going to be called boy when the police came around. Plenty of Black men between the 1920s and the 1960s contributed to traditional male-centered communities and played roles as patriarchs in them, only for them to be burned down by white terrorist mobs. However, I would argue that more typically, the Black Manosphere grows out of conservative pro-Black movements. As I alluded to in previous videos, older generations of Black people who faced a more intense and overtly hostile world of racism and also bore witness to really ugly images and experiences of crime and violence from their own people in Black neighborhoods were very susceptible to a line of thinking that said that Black people's biggest problems was themselves, and that if we just rejected the uglier and negative aspects of Black life and culture and focused more into mimicking what we saw from whiteness, that we would be better off as a people. And to be fair, this isn't wholly untrue. Being closer to whiteness has always been good for people of color, so lighter skinned Black people with certain types of hair or phenotypical features or even names are historically much more likely to fare better in America under white supremacy. But as I alluded to in the Edgelord video and other videos, crime and criminality is socially determined by poverty and lack in environment and structural barriers, and the ability of a handful of Black folks to effectively maneuver white supremacy using what we call respectability politics is not a real solution to the issues that Black people face. The core factor to crime in Black communities is how these communities are designed and policed, not how the people behave or wear their hair or wear their pants. A good way to understand this is to look at something like the opioid epidemic versus the crack epidemic. When crack began to ravage Black communities in the 80s, the response was tougher policing, longer prison sentences, and more police on the street, sending thousands of Black men to jail for petty drug offenses. While they also passed laws that greatly criminalized the possession of crack in Black neighborhoods, but barely criminalized the possession of the much more potent cocaine in white communities.
Reverend Cecil Williams thinks law enforcement crackdowns like the one just announced for Washington, D.C., sweep up the victims as well as the dealers.
It'll be warfare. We will see large numbers of poor people, and specifically Blacks, going to jail and to prison, and they will not have a chance to live, to have a productive life. By 1995, more Blacks would have gone through the criminal justice system. We're predicting 70% at this time, going through the criminal justice system. Now, I ask you, isn't that the way to completely eradicate a race of people?
But then as opioids along with meth surged in white communities over the last decade or so, the policy response has been treatment and mental health services and deterrence programs and community engagement that don't ravage these communities. This is the difference between an addict in recovery moving on with his life versus a convicted felon who is unable to find meaningful employment after a lengthy prison sentence during which his community suffered in his absence, which also raises the possibility of recidivism. But a lot of people don't understand this, and so the strong sentiment in a lot of pro-Black spaces is that the key to Black liberation is the restoration of the Black family and to align said Black family with the traditional images of family normalized to us by the Western white world, aka hegemony. They don't recognize a system that will always find ways to take us out regardless of how well we perform whiteness. But because that dream is so enticing, a lot of enterprising grifters have constantly presented this idea of fixing the Black community through the Black family by making it look more like what we think white families look like, which of course often leads to blaming Black women on not allowing Black men to effectively lead, a narrative made very famous by the Moynihan Report from 1965. The Moynihan Report was a federal report by sociologist something Moynihan. Fuck him. In this report, which is a favorite staple of the Black Manosphere as well as Black conservatives, characterized Black men as infantile and lazy and uninterested in self-betterment, partly because Black women emasculate them. As a cherry on top, the report, which offered no real solutions, gave one prescription that said that maybe these Black men should join the army as a way to reclaim their masculinity. More on that in a later video, but just understand that this report came right in time for the Vietnam War. What a coincidence. This report has been lambasted by a variety of Black scholars for its complete absolvement of the constraints of white supremacy and the legacy of white terrorism on these issues that Black people face in terms of their families in these communities, as well as its oversimplistic views on gender dynamics between Black men and women. It's a report hated both by scholars who discuss Black masculinity and by intersectional feminist scholars. Yet it's a favorite of the Black Manosphere because it gives credence to the conservative talking point that the problem with the Black family is Black women.
Society, they did not expect to happen what happened. Go read the Monahan report and Monahan Scissors. They did not expect to give government assistance and food stamps to the Black community and for women to choose the check over the men.
You often hear Black Manosphere types talk about how the likelihood of a Black child being raised in a single parent home has skyrocketed in the last 20 or 30 years. And this is true, but it's also true for every other race in this country. And it doesn't take into account all the other variables that decide whether or not a person is going to be raised in a two-parent household. What they really just want to say is that it's because Black women aren't submissive enough. They disregard the well-documented structural barriers to Black economic viability or the historical fact that Black women have always worked, partially because their labor was more valuable on the open market at certain times in the last 100 or so years, versus Black men who, even when not excluded from labor, did not have access to some of the more lucrative house caretaker jobs that Black women ended up taking. They just run with the rhetoric about Black women not being submissive and blah, 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 blah. You have heard this before. In accordance to that, there have long since been Black male figures, especially in the comedy world, such as with Patrice O'Neal, and on YouTube even 10, 15 years ago, who have made money and gained notoriety by peddling misogyny disguised as Black liberation. They'll say that the Black family must be fixed and that this cannot be done if the Black woman doesn't get behind her man. It doesn't matter that this has never really been how this has worked in our society, in our culture, and even in many cultures in Africa, or that white supremacy bars so many Black men from access to the economic and social capital they need to be heads of the household. It doesn't matter, do it anyway, or you hate Black people. There are old archives of a lot of these men's content on YouTube if you want to find it. This complicates the Black Manosphere a bit because while these men still uphold the status quo and spew misogyny, they're also responding to a much more specific and legitimate set of oppressions as opposed to their white counterparts. This doesn't make it any better, it just makes their gripes a bit more legitimate. Aside from that, there's not a lot of material difference between Black and white manosphere spaces. Sometimes the misogyny comes from a hotep, sometimes it comes from an aspiring Republican grifter, sometimes it's just a Black version of the same sleazy pickup artist type character. White guys have men going their own way or MGTOW, Black men have Save Yourself Black Man or SYSBM. Aside from this, all the other things between Black and white men in this particular issue are rooted in the same overall constructs, including even some of the most extreme elements, which we'll get to later. One thing I really want to push against, though, is the myth that Black men are more conservative or patriarchal or misogynistic than any other race of men. Pretty much every data point that you can point to about Black men politically and socially disputes this, whether it be voting patterns, opinion polls, habits, and child rearing. There's so much evidence that this is a myth, but sadly, Black men don't get to define themselves for themselves, and the loudest and worst of us often get the most attention, which is also something I'll talk about a little later. That said, the loud bunch of Black men who do attach their identity to the manosphere are just as ardent and dedicated and, ridiculous as any white consumer of the manosphere. So it's hard to see that sometimes. I get it.
Another thing I did is once I recognized where this video was going, I knew I had to reach out to some of my usual folks to make sure there were some Black men speaking on some of those specific elements of the Black experience within this whole phenomenon.
A breakup, how to talk to a woman, how to do this, how to do that. And then the very, very, very first instance of that was this isn't my proudest moment, but when I was 14, 15 years old, I read a pickup lines book, right? And that kind of
heard about him, like the egg boy who made a name for himself accosting Taylor Swift because she was almost 30 and hadn't had kids yet, and was like, your eggs, lady, you need to take care of your pure Aryan eggs, right? And a lot of other dudes like Fresh and Fit, and there's Joker, a guy in the manosphere who literally calls himself heckin' Joker, right? That's cringe.
I think within Black families and Black communities, there are sometimes support structures and stuff, but I think sometimes the the type of support you need is like sometimes people don't know how to give it. I think you're talking, I was thinking about how like I never really got involved in like any incel communities, but like I'm an atheist and I've been, you know, I was like real big into like the new atheism shit back in the day. But that, I mean, that community was just filled with angry white men.
What are you doing? People are watching this. And I'm just like, that's exactly the point. I said, it's one thing to be talking about all of this, you know, we're progressive, we could show vulnerability. It's another thing to actually do it.
What's going on, people? So yeah, this video, which is already like an hour and a half long, would have been longer. It was looking to be almost 3 hours long, and between technical difficulties, contractual obligations to get this video out at a certain time, and just the fact that I was rushing to finish that last part and it really wasn't up to par. It was being edited by me and not Needless, so it didn't have all the nice flares and things that this section has. I decided that I need to split it. And I am disappointed because some elements are gonna have to be significantly reconfigured to make sense, and I don't know, I don't like splitting video. In the next section, I go explicitly into some major figures of the Manosphere, such as Kevin Samuels and Jordan Peterson, and it's a lot of stuff to unpack there, a lot of things to talk about. And yeah, I hope y'all come back for it because I have more thoughts. I'll just say that. More thoughts to share. Yeah, that's it. I appreciate y'all watching. Please support Kugali Comics and their Kickstarter. Shout out to everybody who helped make this video possible. Peace.
Pragmatic.